we'll end off with this beginning part of the war by talking about resistance to the U.S. invasion of New Mexico. After President Polk declares war on Mexico, U.S. military will be sent out into New Mexico. There will be an invasion. And at first, it seems like it's going to be a bloodless invasion, like there's not going to be any resistance. And partly this is due to the upper class of New Mexico, who was pretty much in acceptance of the U.S. Taking over New Mexico. The upper class there in New Mexico are known as the Ricos. The Ricos, as I said earlier, they owned the majority of the good farmland there in New Mexico. They operated in the livestock ranching industry, and they were also a part of that lucrative Santa Fe trade. Made a lot of money off of that. And so the Ricos had a pretty good relationship with the United States because of their connection to the Santa Fe trade. That's where they made a lot of their money, by trading with merchants from the United States. And so when it comes to their livelihood, it depended more so on their relationship with the U.S. than it did with Mexico. And that's why you don't see the Ricos putting up much of a fight against this U.S. invasion at the start of the Mexican-American War. The Ricos not only made money off of the Santa Fe trade, but they also made money from taxing that trade, tariffs. The government of New Mexico, which was dominated by the Ricos, would tax the imports and exports coming from the United States. So that was a huge source of funds for New Mexico, again, dependent on the United States. They also got all of their weaponry from the United States, from the Santa Fe trade. And so, yeah, they had a strong connection with the U.S., and that's why you don't see the Ricos putting up much of a fight when the U.S. comes to invade. But the opposite end of the spectrum is the lower classes of New Mexico and their reaction. So the lower class settlers in New Mexico, they did not want the U.S. to annex and take over New Mexico. And so you find some of them revolting against this U.S. invasion. So the revolt actually comes from the lower class and not the ruling upper class of New Mexico. So it's the Indians and the vecinos, the settlers, who are going to be responsible for this revolt against the United States as they invade New Mexico. And this is known as the Taos Revolt because it takes place in Taos, New Mexico. And so part of the reason why they were upset, the Indians and vecinos, is because they're afraid that when the U.S. takes over, they're going to start taxing the land titles of the settlers, right? Of the people of New Mexico, and they feared that this taxation would be too much for them to pay. Remember, I was saying how the settlers there are usually pretty poor, and their lands weren't the most productive. And so they feared that this taxation would be too much for them to pay, and that they would eventually lose their lands if the United States took over New Mexico. And so it was this fear of taxation and the loss of land that ultimately led to the Taos Revolt. Right? And so with the Taos Revolt, you're going to have a mixture of vecinos, who are Mexican settlers, and Indians revolting against the United States. They're band together. There's a couple of skirmishes that take place first, and eventually the rebels will go into the mission in Taos and pretty much fight against U.S. forces there. They'll bunker down in the mission at Taos. And fight against U.S. soldiers until the mission is set on fire. And once the mission is set on fire, then the rebels are forced to leave the mission. They scatter. Several of them are captured. When I say several, I'm talking about like 50 of them are captured and killed. And then from there, the rebel movement is pretty much over after the revolt at Taos is put down and crushed by the United States. Some of the leaders of the revolt that had been captured would eventually be put on trial, and they're put on trial for treason, because at this point the United States is claiming that New Mexico is part of the United States. right? And so the revolt is seen as a treasonous act. But for the New Mexicans, it's not treason because they're actually, part of Mexico. They feel that they're citizens of Mexico and they're defending their country against invaders. But regardless of their perspective, the United States treats them as acts of treason, and many of the leaders of the Taos Revolt will be ordered to be hanged for treason.